I remember the warmth of the sun that day, how it kissed the back of my neck while I set up the picnic blanket by the riverbank. It was one of those rare Saturdays when time seemed to stretch lazily, the world content to let us bask in its beauty. Our daughter, Sophia, had begged us for a picnic by the water. Mark, ever the indulgent father, agreed immediately, and I was happy to go along, clutching my camera in case inspiration struck. Mark managed a BMW dealership, a man who was sharp in both suits and sales pitches. His success came with its perks, a beautiful house, frequent dinners out, and a sense of stability that I'd grown to cherish over the years. I was a photographer, passionate but far from lucrative, and while our lives often felt worlds apart, we always met in the middle when it came to Sophia. That morning, Mark had packed the cooler with more enthusiasm than I'd seen in weeks, stacking it with sandwiches, fruit, and Sophia's favorite sparkling lemonade. When we reached the riverbank, the sunlight danced on the rippling water, and Mark declared it the perfect day for a swim. "Come on, sweetheart," he'd said to Sophia, stripping down to his swim trunks. "Let's see if this old man can still outswim you." Sophia squealed with laughter as she followed him into the water. I stayed behind, settling onto the blanket, my camera nestled beside me. The peace was intoxicating, until his phone buzzed. It was sitting there, innocuously, beside the cooler. I glanced toward the water where Mark and Sophia were splashing, completely oblivious. It wasn't unusual for me to check his phone for messages. We trusted each other implicitly, or so I believed. Without much thought, I picked it up and tapped the screen. The message opened immediately. It was from an unsaved number. My breath hitched as I read the words. "Thank you for a wonderful evening. You're the best. Let's repeat it soon." The blood in my veins turned to ice. My first instinct was disbelief. Surely this was a mistake, a misunderstanding. My mind raced through 1,000 innocent explanations, but none of them fit. The text was intimate, undeniable. And it felt like a dagger had been plunged into my chest. Mark was laughing in the water with Sophia, his back turned to me, unaware of the storm that had just erupted in my heart. I stared at the phone, my vision blurring with tears, but I blinked them away. Crying wasn't an option. Not yet. Not here. I slipped the phone back onto the cooler and grabbed my camera, focusing the lens on the water. My hands shook as I pretended to fiddle with the settings, but all I could hear was the pounding of my pulse, drowning out the world around me. A plan was already forming in my mind. I couldn't stop watching them, Mark and Sophia splashing in the water, their laughter carrying across the gentle ripple of the river. Mark looked so carefree, so genuine, that for a fleeting moment, I questioned everything. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe the text was some cruel prank or a mistake, though deep down, I already knew better. My stomach churned as I replayed the message in my mind. The words had an unmistakable intimacy that didn't belong to me. He had a way of making me feel special in his presence, of making me believe I was the center of his world. Was that how he made her feel, too? I busied myself with the picnic spread, slicing fruit that I knew neither Mark nor Sophia would touch but needing to keep my hands moving. My thoughts raced. The message didn't just betray his infidelity, it mocked my trust, my effort, my years spent keeping this family together while he spent late nights at the dealership or out on business dinners. The phone was still sitting by the cooler. The temptation to look again was unbearable, but I knew better than to linger there too long. Mark had a habit of checking his phone obsessively, especially when he was hiding something. If he noticed it had been moved or tampered with, my chance to act carefully would vanish. "Mom. Look at this." Sophia's voice pulled me from my spiraling thoughts. She was standing waist-deep in the water, holding up a slimy, squirming fish. Mark cheered her on from behind, the picture of a proud dad. "That's amazing, sweetheart." I called back, forcing my voice to steady. I even managed a weak smile before lifting the camera to my face and snapping a photo of her victorious grin. I couldn't let Sophia know anything was wrong. Whatever storm was brewing between Mark and me, she didn't deserve to be caught in it. I needed a clear head, but with every passing moment, anger and betrayal gnawed at my resolve. When they returned to shore, dripping wet and flushed with exertion, Mark gave me one of his easy smiles, the kind that used to make my heart flutter. "You should have come in," he said, dropping onto the blanket beside me. "The water's perfect." "I'm fine here," I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. Sophia was too busy rummaging through the cooler for a drink to notice the tension. Mark, however, tilted his head, his smile faltering. "Everything okay?" I hated how sincere he sounded. My throat tightened. "Fine. Just tired." His hand brushed my knee, a familiar gesture that used to reassure me. Now it made my skin crawl. How often had he touched me like this after spending time with someone else? How many lies had I swallowed in the name of keeping our life intact? "I'm going to take some pictures of the river," I said abruptly, grabbing my camera. Mark's brow furrowed, but he didn't push. "All right," he said slowly. I walked a few paces down the riverbank, angling my lens at the trees reflected in the water. I barely saw what I was photographing, my mind a whirl of questions. Who was she? How long had this been going on? Did his coworkers know? Above all, one question rang louder than the rest: what am I going to do about this? By the time we packed up the picnic and headed home, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him, not yet. If Mark was cheating on me, I needed proof. Proof that would not only end this charade but leave no room for excuses or manipulation. As Sophia dozed in the back seat on the drive home, Mark reached over and took my hand. I forced myself not to pull away, though my fingers felt like lead in his. "You're quiet today," he said, glancing at me. I shrugged, not trusting myself to speak. When we arrived home, Mark carried the cooler inside while I tucked Sophia into her room, brushing her damp curls off her forehead. "Good night, sweet girl," I whispered, kissing her temple. By the time I joined Mark in the kitchen, he had opened a beer and was scrolling through his phone. My stomach flipped, but I played it cool, grabbing a glass of water and leaning against the counter. "I was thinking," I began casually, "maybe we should take a day off soon, just the two of us. We haven't done that in a while." He looked up, surprised but pleased. "That sounds great. What brought this on?" I smiled faintly. I miss us." It wasn't entirely a lie. I missed the us that I thought we were. Mark nodded, coming over to kiss my forehead. "We'll plan something. Promise." As I watched him walk away, oblivious to the chaos brewing inside me, I made another promise, this one to myself. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. The next morning, Mark left early for the dealership, leaving Sophia and me to our usual routine. She hummed to herself as she poured cereal, blissfully unaware of the turmoil bubbling beneath my calm exterior. As soon as I heard the garage door shut, I sprang into action. Mark had a habit of leaving his laptop at home on weekends, claiming he preferred working from his phone. Today, his laptop sat on the dining table, waiting to reveal its secrets. I carried it into my office and booted it up. Mark trusted me implicitly, or he had, until now, and never bothered with complex passwords. I typed his usual combination of Sophia's birthday and our anniversary, and the screen unlocked. My pulse quickened as I navigated to his email. The inbox was mundane, messages from work, dealership reports, a few automated bills. But the unsaved number from yesterday's message gnawed at me. I opened his text syncing app, scanning the messages one by one. It didn't take long to find her. The thread was a mix of short, flirty texts and longer, more detailed conversations. I could see her name at the top of the screen, Alyssa. The pit in my stomach deepened as I scrolled, reading their exchanges like an outsider peering into someone else's life. Alyssa worked at a nearby high-end spa, and they'd met months ago when Mark was buying gift certificates for the dealership's top sales team. The conversations were full of inside jokes, intimate compliments, and the kind of casual ease that comes with familiarity. "Last night was amazing. I'm still thinking about the way you kissed me before I left." I closed the laptop, leaning back in my chair as bile rose in my throat. There it was, proof. Proof of late nights and secret meetings, of a betrayal that had been festering while I'd been busy holding everything together. I wanted to smash something. I wanted to scream. But more than anything, I wanted to be smart about this. Mark had always been meticulous, a planner. If I confronted him without a strategy, he'd turn it around on me, spin the narrative until I was left doubting myself. I couldn't let that happen. The thought of hiring a private investigator flitted through my mind, but it felt excessive. What I needed was already at my fingertips. I opened the laptop again and took screenshots of the texts, sending them to my email. I also photographed the screen with my phone, just in case. By the time I finished, I felt hollow, like a shell of myself. I had the proof, but it didn't bring the closure I'd hoped for. Instead, it deepened the ache, solidifying the reality I'd been trying to avoid. As I closed the laptop, Sophia called out from the living room. "Mom? Can we go to the park later?" Her voice, so innocent and full of joy, was a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. "Of course, sweetheart," I called back, forcing a smile as I joined her. Later that evening, as Mark returned home, I observed him with new eyes. The way he kissed my cheek felt rehearsed, his cheerful chatter about the day at work almost painfully hollow. "How was your day?" he asked, setting his keys on the counter. "Good," I replied, feigning normalcy. "Sophia and I went to the park. She found a friend to play with and had a blast." "Glad to hear it." He opened the fridge, grabbing another beer. I studied him carefully. He was the same man I'd built a life with, yet now he felt like a stranger. How many times had I missed the signs? How many nights had he come home from work carrying the weight of someone else's affection? I waited until he disappeared into the shower before sneaking back to his phone. It was a dangerous move, but I was desperate for more information. I needed to know just how far this had gone. The text revealed dinner dates, hotel rooms, and even plans for a weekend getaway. Rage simmered beneath my calm exterior as I returned the phone to its original position, making sure it looked untouched. This wasn't just an affair, it was a second life. When Mark emerged from the bathroom, toweling his hair dry, I forced myself to smile. "Everything all right?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "Perfect," I said, my voice steady. "Why wouldn't it be?" He studied me for a moment before shrugging and retreating to the living room. That night, as he slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every breath he took felt like a mockery. I thought about the sacrifices I'd made, the loyalty I'd given, and the trust he'd shattered. I wasn't going to confront him yet, but I also wasn't going to let this slide. The wheels of my plan were already turning. If Mark thought he could deceive me and get away with it, he was sorely mistaken. The days that followed felt like a surreal balancing act. I carried the weight of my discovery while pretending nothing was amiss, playing the role of the doting wife and mother. It was harder than I anticipated. Every glance at Mark felt like staring at a stranger, and every word he spoke carried the undertone of a lie I couldn't unhear. Mark, oblivious, continued his routine. He left early for work, came home late, and occasionally checked his phone with a flicker of something in his eyes, anticipation, maybe. It made my stomach turn. I began paying closer attention to his habits, small things I'd once overlooked. The moments he excused himself to take a call, the nights he came home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. I catalogued every detail, determined not to miss a single clue. But the cracks in my facade were starting to show. "Mom, are you okay?" Sophia asked one evening as I tucked her into bed. I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" "You've just been quiet," she said, her wide, curious eyes studying my face. I stroked her hair, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm fine, honey. Just thinking about a lot of things." She nodded, her trust in me unshaken, and snuggled into her pillow. "Okay. Love you." "I love you too," I whispered, kissing her forehead before turning off the light. That night, I decided to push a little harder. If I was going to confront Mark, I needed more leverage, something that would strip away his ability to deny the truth. I waited until he fell asleep, his deep, steady breathing signaling that he was out cold. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and crept to his phone on the nightstand. He'd grown careless, leaving it unlocked when he fell asleep, a habit I'd noticed and planned to exploit. My hands shook as I scrolled through his messages with Alyssa. Their texts confirmed what I already knew, but one thread stood out. It was about a meeting planned for the following evening at a restaurant on the other side of town. "Can't wait to see you," Alyssa had written. "Me too. 7 p.m. sound good?" Mark replied. My pulse quickened as an idea began to form. If he was going to keep lying, I'd let him dig his own grave, right in front of me. The next day, I told Mark I had a late photography session booked and wouldn't be home until after Sophia was in bed. "Will you be okay putting her to bed?" I asked over breakfast. "Of course," he said, sipping his coffee with that easy smile I'd once loved. "Have fun." He was far too agreeable. It was as though he were already planning how to use his free evening, completely unaware that I knew everything. That night, I left the house at 6:30, dressed casually with my camera bag slung over my shoulder. I kissed Sophia goodbye, waved to Mark, and pulled out of the driveway. But instead of heading to a photography session, I parked a few blocks away and waited. At exactly 6:55, Mark's car pulled out of the driveway. I followed him, keeping my distance. He drove to the restaurant I'd seen mentioned in the messages, pulling into the lot and stepping out of the car in a crisp button-down shirt. I stayed in my car, watching as he went inside. A few minutes later, Alyssa arrived. She was everything I wasn't: tall, striking, and wearing a dress that hugged her in all the right places. They greeted each other with a kiss that sent a wave of nausea through me. But I didn't look away. I couldn't. I grabbed my camera, adjusting the settings for the dim light, and began snapping photos. Each click felt like a small act of revenge, a way to turn the pain into ammunition. They sat at a table near the window, laughing and leaning in close, their body language screaming intimacy. The sight was unbearable, but I forced myself to keep watching, to document every moment. When I returned home later that night, Mark was already in bed, his phone charging on the nightstand. I tucked Sophia in, then sat in my office, staring at the photos on my camera. The images were crystal clear, Mark holding Alyssa's hand, leaning in to whisper something in her ear, and the kiss they shared before parting ways. Proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof. The next morning, Mark acted as though nothing had happened, kissing me on the cheek before heading to work. "Don't forget, we have that dinner with the Goldsteins this weekend," he said, his voice casual. I nodded, my smile tight. "I'll make a note of it." As he left, I thought about the man I'd married and the lies he was living. He thought he was clever, that he could juggle two lives without consequence. He didn't realize I was about to tip the scales. The photos were hauntingly vivid. Each one told a story, a truth Mark could no longer deny. I stared at the images until the sun rose, and with each passing hour, my resolve hardened. By morning, I decided, I wasn't going to confront him just yet. I wanted to lay the foundation for something much bigger, something that would shatter his illusion of control. Over the next few days, I worked quietly. My first step was to secure copies of the evidence. I uploaded the photos to a cloud storage account he didn't know existed, labeling the folder innocuously, Photography Edits 2024. I backed up the texts I'd found and saved voice memos detailing my thoughts and plans. I also reached out to an attorney, one recommended by a friend who'd been through a similar situation. "Start gathering everything," the attorney advised during our initial consultation. "Financial records, communications, anything that proves the affair and any potential misuse of marital funds. The more prepared you are, the stronger your position will be." I spent hours digging through statements, looking for transactions tied to his double life. Spa visits, hotel stays, expensive dinners at places I'd never heard of. It was all there, clear as day. The realization of how much he'd spent on her stung more than I'd expected. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the insult of watching him lavish her with gifts while I budgeted for groceries and Sophia's school activities. A week later, I decided it was time to set the trap. Mark had mentioned he'd be working late again, and I pretended not to notice the way his voice faltered when he said it. "Don't wait up," he added with a sheepish smile. "I won't," I replied, matching his tone. That evening, after I'd tucked Sophia into bed, I slipped out of the house and drove to the dealership. Mark's car wasn't there. I'd suspected as much. He wasn't at work, he was with her. I drove to the same restaurant where I'd photographed them before. Sure enough, their cars were parked side by side. This time, I didn't stay outside. I walked through the front doors, my heart hammering in my chest. The host greeted me with a polite smile. "Table for one?" "Actually, I'm looking for someone," I said, glancing toward the dining area. There they were, seated at a corner booth, laughing as though they didn't have a care in the world. Mark's hand rested on hers, and Alyssa leaned in close, her expression full of adoration. I felt like I was underwater, my pulse roaring in my ears. But I didn't falter. I took a deep breath and walked straight to their table. "Mark," I said, my voice calm and steady. He froze, his face draining of color as he turned to me. Alyssa looked between us, confusion clouding her expression. What are you doing here?" he stammered, his hand slipping away from hers. "I could ask you the same thing," I said, crossing my arms. "Who is this?" Alyssa asked, her voice sharp. "I'm his wife," I replied, meeting her gaze head-on. Her eyes widened, and she leaned back as though the words had physically struck her. Mark looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "This isn't what it looks like," he began, his voice trembling. I let out a dry laugh. "Oh, really? Because it looks like you're on a date with someone who isn't me." Alyssa pushed back from the table, grabbing her purse. "I didn't know he was married," she muttered, her cheeks flushing. I'm sorry." She hurried away, leaving Mark and me alone. He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "Don't. Whatever excuse you're about to give me, save it." The entire restaurant seemed to be watching, their conversations dimming to a quiet murmur. Mark looked around nervously, his face a mixture of anger and shame. "Let's not do this here," he hissed under his breath. "Why not?" "Embarrassed?" I asked, my voice low but firm. "Because you weren't embarrassed when you kissed her in front of this very window last week." He froze, his eyes widening. "I have photos, Mark," I continued, my voice soft but cutting. "Photos, texts, receipts. Do you really want to test me right now?" He stared at me, his jaw working as though trying to form a response. "That's what I thought," I said, straightening. "We'll talk at home." Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the chatter resuming behind me. I didn't know what Mark would do next, but it didn't matter. The first card had fallen, and now it was only a matter of time before the rest of his house of lies came crashing down. I didn't know what to expect when Mark came home that night. I'd left the restaurant feeling an odd mix of triumph and dread, knowing that while I'd seized control of the narrative, the fallout was still looming. I sat in the living room, my laptop open on the coffee table. The photos of Mark and Alyssa were displayed prominently, along with screenshots of their messages and a few of the financial records I'd uncovered. This wasn't going to be a casual conversation, it was going to be a reckoning. When Mark's car finally pulled into the driveway, my pulse quickened. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, his keys jangling as he placed them on the counter. "Hey," he said, his voice cautious. "Sit," I said, nodding toward the couch. He glanced at the laptop, his face tightening. "We really need to talk about this, but..." I said, "Sit." He swallowed hard, lowering himself onto the couch opposite me. The man who usually exuded confidence and control now looked cornered, his eyes darting between me and the screen. "Why didn't you just tell me?" I asked, my voice quiet but steady. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't like that, okay? Alyssa and I." "Don't lie to me," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "I have the texts, the photos, the receipts. Do you really think you can talk your way out of this?" He sank back, his shoulders slumping. "It wasn't supposed to mean anything," he mumbled. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "So it's worse, then. You risked our marriage, our family, for something that didn't mean anything." Mark winced, but he didn't argue. "How long?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He hesitated, then sighed. 6 months. The weight of those words hit me like a physical blow. Half a year of lies. Half a year of looking me in the eye and pretending everything was fine. Was she the only one? What? "Yes," he said quickly. "It was just Alyssa. I swear." I stared at him, searching for any flicker of truth. He looked desperate, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Why, Mark?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why would you do this to us?" He sighed, shaking his head. "I don't know. It just happened. Things haven't been great between us for a while, and Alyssa, she was there, and she listened. She made me feel wanted." His words stung, but they also enraged me. "Do you think I don't want you? Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to keep this family together, to support you, to make you feel loved?" Mark's head dropped into his hands. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "But it did," I snapped. "And now, here we are." For a moment, silence hung between us, thick and suffocating. "I'll end it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll cut her off. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." I let out a shaky breath, leaning back in my chair. "You think it's that simple? That you can just say you're sorry, and everything goes back to normal?" "I'm willing to do the work," he said, his tone earnest. "Therapy, counseling, whatever you want." I stared at him, my emotions swirling in a storm of anger, hurt, and exhaustion. Part of me wanted to believe him, to give him a chance to make amends. But another part of me, the part that had read every message and seen every photo, knew it wasn't that simple. "This isn't just about me," I said, my voice softening. "It's about Sophia. She deserves better than this." Mark flinched, but he nodded. "I know. And I'll do whatever it takes to be a better father." I studied him, my mind racing. "Fine," I said finally. "You want to fix this? Prove it." "How?" "Start by sleeping in the guest room," I said firmly. "You've broken my trust, and it's going to take time to rebuild. If you're serious about making things right, you'll respect that." Mark nodded, his expression grim. "Okay. And no more lies," I added. "From this moment forward, I want complete honesty. About everything." "I understand," he said. As he stood and walked toward the stairs, I watched him go, my chest heavy with uncertainty. His promises sounded sincere, but sincerity alone wasn't enough. If Mark thought he could repair the damage with words, he was sorely mistaken. This wasn't a problem he could charm his way out of. It was just the beginning, and I wasn't sure either of us was ready for what came next. The days that followed felt like a tentative ceasefire, the tension between Mark and me stretching taut like a rubber band about to snap. He moved into the guest room without protest, and while he tried to engage me in small talk, I kept my responses brief, guarded. Sophia noticed the shift almost immediately. "Why isn't Dad having breakfast with us?" she asked one morning, her spoon clinking against her cereal bowl. I hesitated, the weight of her question hanging heavy in the air. "He's been really busy with work, sweetie. He needs some extra rest." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. How could I explain to an 8-year-old that her father was sleeping in the guest room because he'd betrayed everything we'd built together? Mark, to his credit, tried harder with her. He took her to the park after school, helped with her homework, and even volunteered to coach her soccer practice, a level of involvement that felt almost performative. But Sophia loved it. She beamed every time he was around, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. At night, I worked on fortifying my position. The evidence I'd gathered sat neatly in a file on my desk, ready to be used if necessary. I reviewed our financials with meticulous care, noting any discrepancies that might indicate misuse of funds. The attorney I'd consulted had been clear: if this escalated to divorce, I needed to be prepared. And yet, despite everything, a part of me wasn't ready to give up entirely. I needed answers, closure, something to justify the years I'd invested in this marriage. That's how I found myself dialing the number of a marriage counselor, booking a session before I could second-guess myself. When I told Mark about the appointment, he seemed almost relieved. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his tone earnest. "Good," I replied, my voice clipped. We sat in stony silence for the rest of the evening, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. The first session was uncomfortable, to say the least. The counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Keller, began by asking us to share why we were there. Mark glanced at me, his expression pleading. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "A mistake?" I said, my tone icy. "That's what you call 6 months of lying and sneaking around?" Dr. Keller raised a hand gently. "Let's allow each other to speak without interruptions, okay?" Mark nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I know I've hurt you," he continued. "And I hate myself for it. I want to make things right, for both of us, for Sophia." "And how do you plan to do that?" I asked, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "By pretending this never happened?" "I'm not pretending," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm here, aren't I? I'm trying." "Trying doesn't erase what you've done," I shot back. Dr. Keller intervened again, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the storm between us. "It's clear that there's a lot of pain here," she said. "Rebuilding trust is a long process, and it starts with open communication." She turned to Mark. "Why do you think you sought connection outside your marriage?" Mark hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I guess I felt like we'd lost something. Like we were just going through the motions." "And you thought the solution was to go behind my back?" I asked, my voice trembling. He flinched. "No, of course not. I wasn't thinking. I was stupid and selfish, and I didn't realize what I was risking until it was too late." Dr. Keller nodded, her gaze steady. "And you, how are you feeling in all of this?" she asked me. "Angry. Hurt. Betrayed," I said bluntly. "I've given everything to this family, to him, and this is how he repays me? I don't even know if I want to fix this." Mark's face fell, but he didn't speak. "That's a valid feeling," Dr. Keller said. "It's okay to not know yet. Healing takes time, and it's important to be honest with yourself about what you need." As we left the session, Mark walked beside me in silence. When we reached the car, he finally spoke. "I know I've hurt you," he said, his voice soft. "But I'm not giving up. I'll keep going to therapy, keep working on myself. Whatever it takes." I didn't respond. My heart was still too raw, too guarded to let his words sink in. Instead, I stared out the window as he drove us home, the silence between us speaking louder than any words could. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Mark might be trying to make amends, but I wasn't sure if it was enough. For now, I needed to focus on what mattered most: protecting Sophia and figuring out what my future would look like, with or without him. The counseling sessions continued, each one peeling back another layer of the fragile shell Mark and I had built around ourselves. Mark was diligent, too diligent, maybe. He attended every session, answered every question, and offered apologies that felt rehearsed, even when they might have been sincere. But sincerity didn't erase what he'd done. One night after putting Sophia to bed, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook, scribbling something furiously. "What's that?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. He glanced up, startled. "Just notes. Things I want to say in therapy tomorrow." It should have comforted me, this newfound effort of his. But instead, it made me feel empty. He could write pages and pages of apologies, but nothing would erase the image of him holding Alyssa's hand, the look of adoration in his eyes meant for someone else. I crossed the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water, the tension between us palpable. "I'm trying, you know," he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. I gripped the glass tighter. "Trying doesn't change what happened, Mark." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the notebook. "I know. But I don't want to lose you." I didn't respond, the weight of his words sinking like stones into the pit of my stomach. The days blurred into weeks, each one a mix of small triumphs and bitter realizations. Mark's behavior changed noticeably. He came home on time, spent more evenings with Sophia, and stopped checking his phone obsessively. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a performance. One afternoon, while organizing papers in my office, I found a small card tucked into the back of a drawer. It was from Mark, given to me years ago for our anniversary. "To my one and only," it read in his neat handwriting. "Every day with you is the best day of my life." I stared at the words, my chest tightening. Had he meant them back then? Had I? I thought about the version of us that used to exist, the couple who laughed together, dreamed together, and promised forever. That version of us felt like a distant memory, replaced by this hollow, fractured reality. Later that evening, during another counseling session, Dr. Keller asked a question that caught me off guard. "What would it take for you to trust Mark again?" I froze, the question hanging in the air. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know if that's possible." Mark's face crumpled, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the texts, the photos, the lies, and the guilt evaporated. "I know it won't be easy," Mark said, his voice trembling. "But I'll do whatever it takes. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." I turned to him, my eyes narrowing. "And what happens when things get hard again? When the excitement fades? Do you just find someone else to fill the gap?" "No," he said quickly, his voice firm. "I've learned my lesson. I know what I stand to lose now." "You should have known that before," I snapped, my emotions spilling over. "You should have thought about what you were risking before you lied to my face for 6 months." Dr. Keller intervened, her voice calm. "It's okay to feel angry. Betrayal is a deep wound, and it takes time to heal. Mark, part of rebuilding trust is showing consistency over time, not just with your words, but with your actions." Mark nodded, his jaw tight. "I understand." But as I looked at him, I couldn't tell if he truly did. That night, I sat alone in my office, staring at the evidence file on my desk. I hadn't shown it to him yet, hadn't wielded it like the weapon it could be. But it was there, a constant reminder of what he'd done and the leverage I held. As I closed the laptop, I caught my reflection in the dark screen. My face looked tired, older somehow, as though the weight of this betrayal had aged me overnight. I leaned back in my chair, the quiet of the house pressing in around me. Mark was trying, but I wasn't sure it mattered. The cracks in our marriage weren't just surface level, they ran deep, cutting through the foundation of everything we'd built. And no amount of effort could guarantee they'd ever be repaired. I spent the rest of the night weighing my options, wondering if there was still a future for us or if it was time to let go. The truth was, I didn't have the answer yet. But I knew one thing for certain, I wouldn't be making the decision for his sake. It was my life, my choice, and this time, I was putting myself first. One morning, a few weeks after the confrontation at the restaurant, I woke to an email notification on my phone. It was from my attorney. Your requested documents are attached. Let me know if you'd like to proceed with further steps. I opened the email, my heart pounding, and scanned the attachments. Financial records, detailed breakdowns of Mark's expenses, and corroborating timelines of his texts and transactions with Alyssa. Everything I needed was there, a damning tapestry of deceit laid bare in black and white. My throat tightened as I realized how deeply Mark's betrayal went. He hadn't just stolen moments from me, he'd stolen resources meant for our family, funneling them into lavish outings and gifts for someone else. The weight of it hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just an affair, it was a calculated betrayal. I kept the information to myself, unsure of when, or how, I'd use it. Mark had been careful not to cross any boundaries since our counseling began, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his remorse was driven more by fear of losing his comfortable life than genuine regret. That suspicion grew stronger one evening when I overheard him on the phone. I know, he whispered, his voice barely audible. But I can't do anything right now. She's watching me like a hawk. My chest tightened, and I stepped closer to the door, holding my breath. I just need time to figure it out, he continued. You have to trust me. The call ended abruptly, and I hurried back to the kitchen before he could catch me eavesdropping. My hands shook as I stirred a pot of soup, the anger bubbling inside me even more than the broth on the stove. That night, I confronted him. Who were you talking to earlier? I asked, crossing my arms as he sat on the couch, pretending to watch TV. He glanced at me, his face betraying a flicker of unease. No one. Just a work call. Don't lie to me, I said sharply. I heard you. Mark's expression shifted from defensive to guilty. It wasn't what you think, he said quickly. I was just tying up loose ends. With Alyssa? I demanded, my voice rising. He hesitated, and that pause told me everything I needed to know. Unbelievable, I muttered, shaking my head. It's not what you think, he insisted, standing up. I was telling her it's over. That's it. I swear. Why are you still talking to her at all? I shot back. You promised me you'd cut her off. I am, he said, his voice desperate. I'm trying to end things cleanly, but she's making it difficult. She doesn't understand. Because you haven't made her understand, I snapped. You've been stringing her along just like you've been stringing me along. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. What do you want me to do? I want you to be honest for once in your life. I shouted, the dam of my patience finally breaking. I want you to stop pretending like you're the victim here and take responsibility for the mess you've made. He stared at me, his chest rising and falling as though he were struggling to breathe. I know about the money, Mark, I said, my voice quieter but no less cutting. His eyes widened. What money? All of it, I said coldly. The dinners, the hotels, the spa trips. Every dollar you took from this family to spend on her. Mark's face crumpled, and he sank back onto the couch. Save it, I said, holding up a hand. I've already spoken to an attorney. I have everything I need. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I messed up, he whispered. I messed up so badly. You think? I said bitterly. That night, I sat in my office, staring at the folder of evidence on my desk. Mark had spent weeks claiming he wanted to make things right, but his actions told a different story. It was time to stop waiting for him to change. I opened my email and drafted a reply to my attorney. Let's proceed. With a deep breath, I hit send. The next morning, I told Mark. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice steady. He looked up from his coffee, his eyes wide with disbelief. You're serious? Dead serious, I replied. What about therapy? About working through this, he asked, his voice breaking. I shook my head. You had your chance, Mark. I gave you time, and all you did was lie to my face again and again. I'm done. He sat there, stunned, as I turned and walked away, the weight of my decision lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of paperwork, difficult conversations, and logistical challenges. Telling Sophia was the hardest part. Mark and I agreed to sit her down together, but even that felt like a performance, his remorseful expression and soft tone a stark contrast to the betrayal simmering beneath the surface. "We love you so much," I told her, holding her small hands in mine. "That's not going to change. But sometimes, moms and dads decide they're better as friends." Her wide eyes filled with tears, and she threw her arms around my neck. "I don't want you to stop being married." I held her tightly, my own tears falling into her hair. "I know, sweetheart. I know this is hard. But you're going to have both of us, always." Mark joined the embrace, his voice trembling as he promised her that everything would be okay. For a brief moment, we were a family again, fractured, but still together. Once the initial shock wore off, the reality of separation settled in. Mark moved into a small apartment across town, and I began the process of rebuilding our lives. Sophia adjusted more quickly than I expected, her resilience a bittersweet reminder of the strength I wished I'd had at her age. Mark tried to stay involved, picking her up from school and attending her soccer games, but the distance between us was palpable. Every interaction felt like navigating a minefield, his apologies and awkward attempts at small talk grating against the wall I'd built to protect myself. One evening, as I sorted through old photo albums, I stumbled upon a picture from our wedding day. We were standing on the steps of the church, beaming at each other, the world at our feet. I stared at the photo for a long time before tucking it back into the box. That chapter was over, and it was time to focus on what came next. Months later, as the divorce finalized, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. The weight of the betrayal still lingered, but I'd also discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I threw myself into my photography, booking more shoots than ever before and even landing a few high-profile clients. My work became a refuge, a way to channel the pain into something meaningful. One afternoon, I was setting up for a session in the park when a man approached, his young daughter skipping beside him. "Excuse me," he said with a warm smile. "Do you take family portraits?" "I do," I replied, returning the smile. He introduced himself as Daniel, a single father new to the area. As we chatted, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. That evening, as I uploaded the day's photos to my computer, I thought about how far I'd come. The woman who had once been paralyzed by betrayal was now standing on her own, carving out a life filled with purpose and possibility. Mark's choices had shattered the foundation of our marriage, but they hadn't broken me. If anything, they'd forced me to rediscover who I was beneath the roles of wife and mother. Sophia's laughter echoed down the hall, a reminder of the joy still present in our lives. I glanced at the calendar, noting an upcoming trip to the zoo we'd planned together. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace.